Today's lecture is a follow-up to the demand and supply lecture, change in demand, change in quantity demanded, shifting supply and demand curves. So now that you know about demand and supply, we're going to be looking at the relationship between the two, and that would be talking about equilibrium. Beside equilibrium, we will also talk about shortages and surpluses, which would be points away from equilibrium. Now, at equilibrium, the market is going to clear, which means that your quantity demanded is equal to your quantity supplied, not demand equal to supply, because if you said demand is equal to supply, you are implying that it is one and the same line, which it is not. It is only one point on the demand curve that matches one point on the supply curve. So if we're looking at this information right here, we are going to be matching or comparing the quantity demanded and quantity supplied at different prices. And we will see that when the price is 7, quantity demanded is relatively low, quantity supplied is relatively high. And it is only at price $4 that quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. And that's where the market clears. We have equilibrium. Now the same happens on your graph. Your demand curve crosses your supply curve at a price of $4 and a quantity of 20 units. So at this point, your market is in equilibrium. And the market has no unsatisfied buyers and no unsatisfied sellers at that price. So what happens if your price is either above or below equilibrium? So let's start with a price above equilibrium. Right here, you would see that it would be, let's say, a price of $6. Here, you have 10 units that are being demanded, while 30 units are being supplied. The difference between the two is 20, which is a surplus, too much. What happens as a result? The price is going to fall. And as the price falls from 6 to 5, you see that more people are willing to buy it, but at the same time, fewer producers would really like to supply. And you could see the same thing here on the graph. At price 6, you will see a quantity demanded, because it's of the demand curve, of 10 units, while quantity supplied is right here of 30 units. You have a surplus of 20 units. As the price falls, the surplus is going to be smaller until you reach equilibrium. Now, what happens if the price is below? Below equilibrium, it would imply that it is very cheap. If it is very cheap, you probably would think that there is going to be a shortage. Many people willing to buy and not too many producers willing to supply. And this is what happens here. You see that at price $2, you have 10 units that are being supplied or demanded. Well, since this point is on the supply curve, it's going to be your quantity supplied. And then you compare this with quantity demanded of 30. You see that many more people are willing and able to buy it, but very few producers are willing to supply. This is going to be a shortage, while this one was a surplus. And so, if there is a shortage, price will tend to go up, and it goes up until it clears, and that would be your equilibrium. Generally speaking, you would have a market that will allocate your resources according to the demand and supply price. But sometimes the government is going to be stepping in order to correct or reallocate those resources. So there are two situations where the government would step into the market to correct it. One would be to help producers, and the other one would be to help the consumers. It makes sense that if the government is going to try and help producers, it is going to hold prices high, prices above equilibrium. This is the sort of situation that you would have in agriculture, where we are putting the price of certain materials, certain agricultural products above the market price, the market equilibrium price that we would have. The reason for that is to help farmers. We would like to have a large number of farmers. That gives more competition. But of course, it does have negative side effects too. On the other hand, if the government will try and help the consumers, it's going to hold the price artificially low. So that's how we would end up with price floors or price ceilings. So when we're looking at the graph, where are we going to place the price ceiling? The price ceiling should be placed below equilibrium, let's say right here. And this would also be called your maximum price. Because if you were to place your price ceiling above, it would really have no impact on the market, because there would be no reason for you to reach that higher price and not go beyond it, since the equilibrium is way below. So what happens when you put a price ceiling? And let me give you an example of a price ceiling. For instance, rent control. Rent control says that you, as a supplier of rental units, you cannot charge more than a particular amount. So what happens is that very few suppliers, very few landlords would be willing to supply. But of course, since the price is so low, then you would have many consumers, many renters that would like to rent. So what happens as a result? Do you have a shortage or a surplus? There is definitely a shortage, but can this be brought up? Can the price go up? And the answer is no, because the government says that's the maximum amount that you can. So you have a difficult time finding a place to rent in a rent control area. Sometimes people go as far as looking at the obituaries to try and figure out who passed away in what area, and obviously, hopefully, there is going to be an apartment that will be made available for rent. So that would be your maximum or your price ceiling. On the other hand, if you are trying to help the producer, you are going to be holding your price artificially high. And so this, right now, is going to be your price floor. And this is going to be a minimum. And it is kind of contrary to what we understand as floor and ceiling, because usually a floor is low and a ceiling is high. But keep in mind that the reason for the floor and the ceiling is to prevent from reaching equilibrium. Now this help to consumers or producers is only a very short-term situation, because if you're looking at the price ceiling, what is going to happen to the supply of rentable space? And the answer is it's going to be going down. Not only will there be very little new building that will take place, but also the existing units will not be upkept, because there is no incentive for landlords to make the living environment more pleasant. On the other hand, with a minimum, you will have to subsidize the different consumers if those prices are held artificially high, and this is really a necessity. So if this is something that is an integral part of your budget, you need to have this particular item, then because the prices are too high, you are going to have to subsidize the individual consumers. So if the price of food is too high, you're going to have, let's say, food stamps or money that will be given to lower income families in order to be able to make sure that they can provide their families with adequate nutrition. So that would be the situation of a price floor and of a price ceiling to prevent it from coming to equilibrium. And you have to be able to also discuss the consequences. So this is fine in the short run, but in the long run, it's going to be a complicating factor. Now, the next thing we're going to do with the demand and supply curves is to shift them simultaneously. So let's say that we start with one equilibrium. Here's your demand, here's your supply, and this is your equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. So the next thing we're going to do using demand and supply is to shift both, and to do that simultaneously, and to figure out what will happen to the equilibrium quantity and to the equilibrium price. So here you have a demand and a supply curve, and what I'd like you to do is stop the tape for a minute and move both. Increase your demand and increase your supply and check what has happened as a result. So here we are again with the answers, and you can see that I have three situations: 1, 2, and 3. And in all cases, I have increased the demand and increased the supply. Yet, I get 3 different answers. So here, as I increase the demand and increase the supply, the new equilibrium in blue is a higher price and a higher quantity. Now, when we're looking at this second part, you see that again I have increased the supply, increased the demand, but now prices are lower, although quantity is still higher. And the last part, that's your Q2 here. The last part, I have again increased demand, increased supply, and what do we see? Well, we see that there is no change in price, but that there is an increase in quantity. So what has happened for me to get 3 different answers, although I did the same move in all 3? And the answer is, it is the extent to which I moved the demand in relationship to the supply curve in order to achieve different answers. Here you see that your demand shifted by much more than the supply. We want many more, yet producers increase the supply a little bit. Here, on the other hand, you see that you have a much larger increase in supply in response to a relatively small increase in demand. And then here, you will see that the increase in demand roughly matches the increase in supply, so that prices remain constant and quantity increases. So what is the common thread here? Well, in all those different situations, we have had an increase in quantity. Price was once higher, lower, or remained equal. We could also express this by saying that if demand, when demand increases, what happens to price and what happens to quantity? When demand increases, price goes up and quantity goes up. Demand alone, right? Now what happens when supply increases? When supply increases, prices fall, quantity goes up. So, as a sum, you will notice that when those 2 went up, quantity went up in both cases. So for sure it will have to be going up. While demand, price as a result of an increase in demand and an increase in supply, on the one hand went up, on the other hand went down. So we're really not quite sure. Therefore, to formulate a question for that, you would say, which one has to increase? And the answer would be only quantity, because price could have gone up, down, or remained the same. So now, another way of looking at that would be to say, what would you have to change and how would you have to change demand and supply in order to get to, let's say, no change in quantity but an increase in price? Try that and we'll get right back to you. Okay, so now the question was which way or which direction would you change demand and supply curves in order to have no change in quantity but an increase in price? So we start with the original demand and supply. And since we would like no change in quantity, then the new equilibrium will have to be along a vertical line that will show no change here. Right here. Now, did we want a higher price or a lower price? Higher price, therefore, the equilibrium would be somewhere around there. Now, what is this line? If we extend that, it's a downward sloping line, so this must be D2, the second demand, while this is your supply curve. So the two cross right here, you will have no change in quantity, but a higher price than the original equilibrium. Actually, the quantity could be higher or lower or equal. But it is only the price that will have to be going up as a result of shifting the demand curve out, that would be an increase, and your supply curve is going to have to decrease in order to give you no change in quantity but a higher price. So as a summation to the lecture, for today, we looked at the equilibrium, where the market cleared. We looked at shortages or surpluses. A shortage is when the price is below equilibrium, and a surplus would be if the price is above. We also looked at price floors and price ceilings. A price floor will have to be above equilibrium, contrary to what common sense tells us. And the price, the maximum price or the price ceiling is going to be below. Then we shifted both demand and supply to try and figure out what happens to our ultimate equilibrium. So I hope you have enjoyed that. See you next time.